As our first panel begins to assemble on stage, I'd like to explain how we'll be conducting the upcoming panel sessions. At the beginning of each panel, the moderator will give a brief introduction of the panelists, who will then each make a 5-minute opening statement. Following the panelists' statements, we plan to have a 45-minute question and answer period. The moderator will officiate, but the question will be from amongst the panelists or from you in the audience. You can submit your questions one of 4 ways. If you have a cell phone, you can text or email your question to the number or email address on the cards at your table or on the number on the screens above me that will probably show up soon. We also have 2 volunteers from West Point Academy who will be at the wings with microphones if you'd like to say your question, or there will also be volunteers from the J5 who will be able to take your questions and get them to the moderator. Please be sure to raise your hands and include your name with your question. Once again, please include your name. And then we will attempt to get in as many questions as we can in this time period. Now, I'd like to introduce our first panel moderator, Dr. Brad Roberts. Dr. Roberts is the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. From April 2009 to March 2013, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. In this role, Dr. Brad Roberts and Panel 1.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to help kick off the symposium. Our topic on this first panel, as you know, is competition and deterrence. Question, congruence or divergence? This is the 11th year of this process. There was one year that got lost to the Budget Control Act or a government stand down or something. And it began 11 years ago as an effort to redress the loss of focus on deterrence and on the nuclear mission that had become starkly evident by 2006, 2007, and 2008. And some of you will recall the report of the Schlesinger panel on the DoD nuclear mission, which gave very stiff criticism of the state of thinking inside the Department of Defense and in the larger engaged defense community on questions of deterrence. And so this command stepped up. It was astonishing to me that they found 450 people 11 years ago that were willing to sit in this room together or a similar nearby room to discuss deterrence. I would say the vast majority were in listen and learn mode because there were relatively few, a much smaller number, who had been engaged in deterrence-related thinking in those interim years. And the command deserves great credit for the progress it's made and for the community of interest it has helped develop to think about and discuss and debate deterrence issues in a modern context. And then came the invitation to a new focus. And in case you don't remember the subtitle of the National Security Strategy of 2017, it's a strategy to renew America's competitive advantage. And the subtitle of the National Defense Strategy of 2018, Sharpening the American Military's Competitive Edge. And that defense strategy finished with a paragraph that talked about this being a strategy, Secretary Mattis's strategy, to compete, to deter, and to win. A third verb, a third focus. Now, this shift in focus, or this additional focus onto competition, has been widely credited, enjoys broad bipartisan support, reflects a sense of many people that this is a kind of belated acknowledgement of a shift that occurred earlier in the international system while we were preoccupied with another problem. But this shift brings with it a host of questions. First and foremost, are these goals compatible, complementary, congruent in the term of our agenda? And are the strategies to achieve them congruent, compatible, and complementary? And a second closely related question is, what are the goals, after all? What does it mean to compete? What are we competing for? The administration's answer on this topic, is at least as evident in the National Defense Strategy, is frankly a bit fuzzy. The National Defense Strategy Commission had a less polite set of adjectives to describe the lack of thinking. I mean, to say that our goal in competition is to expand the competitive space, what does that doesn't mean something very specific to most people. And the NDS generally criticized the underdeveloped thinking on many of the principles that were set out in the early strategic documents of this administration. Another example of some fuzziness of thinking in the views of the National Defense Strategy Commission is about deterrence. Despite our headway in creating a community that thinks about this, and despite our continued emphasis in national strategy documents on deterrence, to quote the National Defense Strategy Commission, they found, quote, little consensus on what deterrence means in practice, and DoD leaders have difficulty articulating how the U.S. would defeat major power adversaries should deterrence fail. They also questioned the commitment to overmatch. We're competing for overmatch. This is the term from the National Security Strategy, defined as, quote, a combination of capabilities and sufficient scale to prevent enemy success, or in the words of one senior DoD leader, strategic dominance. Well, the case that these goals and strategies and definitions are complementary is made by the administration in its national security strategy. We face adversaries who have studied the American way of war. They've developed theories of success in war and crisis in the gray zone. And the strategy describes competition as part of the solution to this way of war against us, that it will deny our adversaries confidence in the theories they set out, that they will find it too unacceptably risky to engage in wars against a United States that, after all, has superior conventional power to bring to bear sooner or later. And the national security strategy goes on to say that competition will give us, quote, the means to convince our adversaries that we can and will defeat them, not just punish them. And these things will all reinforce deterrence. Well, so is this so? Is this logic sound? Are the goals congruent, or might they conflict? What might be some of the unintended and undesired third order or second order effects of embracing competition? One echo of the embrace was in the Chinese Defense White Paper that came out last week or the week before, which described in very crisp terms the U.S. commitment to competition, strategic competition. Attached to this, the usual Chinese complaint that this is America again in search of, quote, absolute security, which it defines as the freedom from attack and the freedom to attack. And by the way, that definition comes out straight out of the Joint Vision 2010 document. They are motivated to compete in new ways with us. What's that second and third order effect, and do we seek strategic dominance over China? Is that what was intended in the formulation? But we should also understand that there are unintended and possibly undesired consequences for the perceptions and strategies of our allies. By and large, our allies seek a more robust U.S. posture to compete, deter, and win. And particularly in East Asia, our allies have been concerned that we've been passive in the face of China's rising competitive agenda in that region. But our allies are, while they're eager, they're also reluctant to be engaged in for us to try to recruit them into a campaign to put America first, a campaign that will antagonize their major power neighbor, and that we might abandon at some point in favor of some other project So there's some complicated terrain here for our allies, too, in moving into this new focus on strategic competition. So to think more deeply into this set of questions, we have an excellent panel that the command has put together for us. We've been asked to keep our introductory remarks very brief, and I'm sure I have a very disciplined panel that will follow the instructions to the T. Assuming we get through our introductory remarks promptly, we will have about 30 to 45 minutes for discussion from the floor. So please do feed in your questions, and I will keep an eye for those who wish to speak from the floor. We are on the record. Bear that in mind as you pose your question from the floor and comments from the panel. We are being recorded and streamed. I will, in order to save time, dispense with the reading of the full biographies of the panelists. You have those in front of you, and thus the opportunity to read them. We will proceed in the order that the names appear on the agenda. We'll begin with Dr. Nancy Gallagher, who is the director of the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Maryland. We will then turn to Mr. Robert Taylor, who's Deputy Director for Plans and Policy here at STRATCOM. He'll be followed by Celia Perkins, First Assistant Secretary for Strategic Policy in the Department of Defense of Australia. She will be followed by Rear Admiral Fukuda, Deputy Director J5 on the Japanese Joint Staff. And in sweep will be Paul Bernstein, Distinguished Research Fellow at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Without further ado, let me turn the microphone over to Nancy Gallagher. Thank you, Nancy.
Good morning. Just to get things off to a lively start, I'm going to argue that making great power competition as an end in itself, the strategic paradigm for U.S. policy, is a zero-sum approach to international relations that makes deterrence more difficult, dangerous, expensive, and unreliable. I study strategic logics for competition and cooperation, and the U.S. government's views of great power relations today have important similarities with the early years of the Cold War and the late 1970s to the mid-1980s, two very difficult time periods made more dangerous by U.S. policy choices. In each of those time periods, we assumed that the Soviet Union was aggressive, untrustworthy, willing to take big risks for small gains, and only understood superior force. Whenever the Soviets signaled a sincere interest in some form of cooperation, we assumed it was a trick. We acknowledged the existence of common interests. We paid lip service to international law and norms. We went through the motions of diplomacy, but mainly to make the United States look good and the Soviets look bad in order to increase domestic, allied, and international support for U.S. military buildup and competitive policies. We insisted that we didn't want war and that our intentions were purely peaceful, but took many overt and covert actions in the gray zone that made war more likely. We also believed that a decisive and meaningful victory would become possible if the United States only worked a little harder, achieved some sort of technological breakthrough, or devised a particularly bold and skillful strategy for using the capabilities it has, but we could never explain exactly how we would achieve that decisive strategic victory. In the early 1945 through 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union initially pursued a purely competitive strategy in the nuclear realm and treated disarmament negotiations as a way to secure political points against each other while avoiding constraints on their own weapons development. They soon recognized, though, that unconstrained competition would lead to disaster and started signaling interest in some forms of limited cooperation, but each dismissed the other's proposals as mere propaganda. The United States tried to maintain nuclear superiority, the Soviet Union tried to catch up, but the arms race only intensified vulnerability and insecurity on both sides. The United States evaluated a number of strategies, including preventive nuclear war, to address key threats without having to compromise or cooperate with the Soviet Union, but none seemed viable. So we relied on a mix of coercive diplomacy, civil war, and covert action to try to compete short of all-out nuclear war. We evolved through the 1960s and into the 1970s into a different strategic paradigm of basically one based more on mixed motives, where we couple deterrence and competition with arms control and various forms of informal cooperation to reduce the costs and risks of competition. And we were really focused on three broad strategic objectives. We wanted to deter deliberate attack, but we also recognized that it wasn't rational once both sides had secure retaliatory capabilities. We were particularly focused on deterring an inadvertent deterrence failure, with a focus on crisis stability, reliable command and control, non-proliferation, early thinking about nuclear terrorism. And that objective in particular required some degree of cooperation with the Soviet Union. And we were interested in cooperation to reduce the costs of security policy, the economic, political, environmental, and moral costs. The late 1970s and early 1980s brought a return to the idea that we were in pure competition with the Soviet Union. Rapid technological change had led some in the United States to believe that the United States could limit damage enough to prevail in a nuclear war, relying predominantly on information and space technologies that made more accurate offensive weapons and provided new hopes for missile defense. But rather than saying straight out that that's what our strategic objective was, we attributed that to the Soviet Union. And in effect, US strategists and policymakers blamed the Soviets for the demise of detente, claimed they were violating some arms control agreements and taking advantage of loopholes in others to surge ahead while the United States was lulled into complacency. We asserted that the Soviets thought they could fight and win a nuclear war by destroying US ICBMs, then threatening to attack US cities if the US retaliated rather than surrendered. And we insisted that the only way to deter the Soviets was to convince them that we believed that we could fight and win a nuclear war, and to develop the capabilities and demonstrate the will to use those capabilities. Naturally, the Soviets saw whatever we did in the name of strengthening deterrence as evidence that we were preparing to initiate nuclear war, and the situation got increasingly dangerous. There are many parallels to today's assertions about Russian and Chinese aggressive motives, violations or lack of interest in arms control, and escalate to de-escalate strategies or taking advantage of our Achilles heel. Right? Yet when the United States was actually able to interview former Soviet military officials, top strategists after the Cold War was over, it became clear that their strategy had been defensive rather than offensive, and that what we saw as evidence of preparations to exploit our window of vulnerability were really attempts to ensure that they still had a secure retaliatory capability despite advances in US hard target kill capabilities. The Cold War ended not because the United States achieved a decisive victory, but because the United States and the Soviet Union both recognized that they needed to find ways to get their competition under control. And they both developed new paradigms for a mix of competition and cooperation, which enabled them to agree on a number of arms control agreements and make a wide variety of other changes that were very important. But their paradigms for cooperation were different in important ways, and we didn't recognize that, which I would argue is why the post-Cold War period has proved to be unstable and relatively short-lasting. Today, the United States' relations with Russia and China are certainly competitive, but we have many more common interests and less stark ideological differences than we did during the Cold War. Technology is rapidly changing, particularly in areas like space, cyber, and AI, so it's tempting to believe that one side or the other could make some type of breakthrough or develop a new strategy that would enable decisive victory. But this is no more realistic now than it was in the 1950s or the 1980s. Competition and risk-taking is even more dangerous now than it was then, because inadvertent nuclear war remains a very real danger, and the global economy has become so interconnected that we risk a global financial crisis or an economic slowdown to the point that threatens domestic stability, civil war, and terrorism. So I would argue that we need to figure out what our new paradigm or paradigms are for cooperation to keep the risks of competition under control, to stabilize deterrence, and to ultimately, once again, reduce the role that threats and use of force play in great power relations.
Thank you, Nancy, for a provocative and timely start. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Nancy, also for that opening strategic view on how to think about competition at that level and across the whole of government. I'm going to focus my comments a little more specifically on the military and the operational aspect of that. I'll start with a little bit from the NDS. Brad gave some opening pieces of that and its relationship. I'll talk a little bit about where I think competition fits with deterrence overall, and then apply that operational perspective on where I think we're at from a DoD and USSTRATCOM and broadly military perspective. So first, a bit from the NDS and where we sit from a global security environment. The Department of Defense's enduring mission is to provide combat credible military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of our nation. And no doubt about it, should deterrence fail, the joint force is prepared to fight and win. But most importantly for this conversation, day to day, the military role is to reinforce America's traditional tools of diplomacy. The department provides military options to ensure the president and our diplomats negotiate from a position of strength. Today, we are emerging from a period of strategic atrophy. Our competitive military advantage has been eroding. We are facing increased global disorder characterized by decline in the long-standing rules-based international order. Interstate strategic competition and not terrorism is now the primary concern in U.S. national security. China is a strategic competitor using predatory economics to intimidate its neighbors while militarizing features in the South China Sea. Russia has violated the borders of nearby nations and pursues veto power over the economic, diplomatic, and security decisions of its neighbors. As well, North Korea's outlaw actions and reckless rhetoric continue despite United Nations censure and sanctions. And Iran continues to sow violence and remains the most significant challenge to Middle East stability. Despite years of counterterrorism operations, threats to stability remain as terrorist groups with long reach continue to murder the innocent and threaten peace more broadly. So I propose that competition, particularly in this state-centered approach, is a necessary component of effective deterrence, and that the military element of national power must operate globally through multiple domains to retain positional and, more importantly, psychological advantage, eroding adversary confidence in their strategies to attack the U.S. or our allies. As most people in this room know, the Unified Command Plan assigns strategic deterrence as a main responsibility for U.S. Strategic Command. And the two key elements of that are leading planning and executing operations. And I advocate that that's where competition exists and where it needs to exist more effectively from a Department of Defense standpoint. Deterrence in its simplest terms, it's talked about previously, capability, credibility, and will, and I will add always in a position, always in an advantageous position to deny benefits, impose costs, and if deterrence fails, restore that deterrence. And as mentioned previously, our adversaries have learned from the last decade of conflict that if they operate asymmetrically in the gray zone using hybrid warfare, approaching what they perceive as red lines, but rarely crossing those, and conducting operations below the level of armed conflict to gain some form of advantage in this space between day-to-day and contingency. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So this is the competitive space. This is the space where deterrence operations live, and this is the space where we've got to get better from an all-domain perspective. So a little bit on competition and where I think it fits here from that aspect. Competition is continuous, and clear end states are difficult to identify, much less attain. Success in competition means gaining and maintaining sufficient influence, advantage, and leverage to secure interests. A dynamic challenge that constantly evolves with geopolitical and technical developments. The ever-evolving effect of competition is some level of deterrence or potentially some lack of deterrence, if not effective. Three core concepts that I mentioned there, influence, advantage, and leverage, form the common ways to affect these interests in this space. Influence to cause and effect in indirect or intangible ways. Advantage being superiority of position or condition, inherently relative, and the constant interplay of those actions at the national and operational level used to manage and employ influence. And leverage being the application of advantage gained or created to achieve an effect or exploit an opportunity, demonstrating to the adversary the vulnerability of his position. And through this constant interplay, adversaries are deterred from acting because confidence in success is eroded, the benefit of action is denied, or the cost is just plain too high. So competition provides opportunities to remain in a perpetual position of advantage, to avoid war, ensure favorable conditions through escalation, and in the event of conflict or war, deliver the joint force to win with all possible enabling advantages. Finally, and maybe most importantly, building influence with our allies, partners, and others is critical to develop and sustain conditions of advantage in this competitive space. So let's talk a little bit about application, and then I'll get off the stage here. From a U.S. operational military perspective, we are really good at training, fighting wars, and winning. The plans and operations model we use addresses the spectrum of conflict through two main frameworks: global campaign plans and what is now called, from a contingency plan standpoint, the global integrated base plans. The global campaign plans marginally address the integrated actions necessary to compete in the spectrum of day-to-day conflict, phase zero, or hybrid gray zone activities. Now, part of the GCPs, or the global campaign plans, are flexible response options. And I argue that the current set of options are largely and fully predictable and just that, responsive versus proactive to deter the actions we are now responding to. The playbook has been read, copied, and distributed. Flow a carrier strike group, fly some bombers, move some missile defense assets to protect regional neighbors and partners. And I would say added in most recently in years to highlight Mike sitting over there, my buddy from Cybercom, some kinds of cyber actions. I think Iran fully expected the U.S. to respond as we did in the Straits, minus the lack of a direct kinetic strike. And then the other side of this is contingency. The military knows how to flow forces, project power, and fight if necessary, but the real question here is whether or not we will have ceded our advantages by the time we must fight because we haven't been actively competing to retain those advantages. So we have a gap in our planning and operations construct, the gap between day-to-day campaigning and contingency, flowing forces to fight and win wars. The gap is where we must combine our capabilities to proactively compete, retain advantage, and provide pressure for the other forms of power to successfully deter. So the key word in my last statement was proactively, and in the face of 21st century global threats, we do not have the luxury of being solely a reactive force. We must secure and retain physical, psychological, informational, and narrative advantage. This all-domain maneuver is always adjusting to maintain a position of strategic advantage with combatant command interdependent capabilities designed to hold the adversary's strategy through their own vulnerabilities at risk. This is a proactive combination of offense and defense, not just response options. So in closing, the U.S. has had competitive whole-of-government approaches in the past, from the Monroe Doctrine to Kennan's containment. Building on wisdom from that past, a contemporary approach for competition should be rooted in a pragmatic assessment of U.S. interests. It should meet challenges using statecraft tempered by a sober realism with respect to U.S. and allied capabilities, resources, and will. A deeper understanding of other actors' perspectives, enhancing options to competition, and sharpening deterrence while identifying and exploiting openings for alignment should focus the approach. To that end, leaders need a better understanding of the joint forces' role in competition and a comprehensive view that greater risk early can lead to much less risk later. And from Sun Tzu, the best victory is when the opponent surrenders of its own accord before there are any actual hostilities. It is best to fight, or it's best to win without fighting.
Thank you, Bob. Now, Celia Perkins.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. An Australian perspective, as a middle power, how do we understand major power competition and consider deterrence in an increasingly complex period? Without question, we're in a period of major power competition. It's political, it's economic, it's military, and in the case of Russia, it's territorial. It's intense and it's persistent. Australia views from our part of the world the major power competition, particularly as it plays out in the Indo-Pacific region, through two important lenses. One is understanding and securing our national interest, and the second is an abiding commitment to the rules-based global order developed primarily post-World War II. Our goal is a sustained peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. But that peace and prosperity is threatened by the actions of major powers in our region, and what we've referred to on this panel already this morning as persistent grey zone activity that doesn't look and feel like traditional competition. We face persistent hostile cyber activity and attack, the breaking of norms in our region and globally, economic coercion, identified political interference, and military activity outside the norms of what we have grown to expect in our part of the world. In a period of competition and non-traditional grey zone activity, how do we gauge risk? How do we understand intent? How do we address the key challenge of understanding red lines, understanding threat and planning responses in a coordinated way? How do we avoid miscalculation? And at the same time, how do we balance the appropriate expansion and growth of the countries of the region, economically seeking their own prosperity and seeking their own network of access and influence? Australia is approaching this question in a very serious way, and I'll outline three key pillars of that. First of all, from the premise that a credible deterrence requires a credible defence capability, the 2016 Defence White Paper, our government's stated defence policy, includes in it the most significant recapitalisation of the Australian Defence Force we've ever seen. The government will invest over $200 billion in the next 2 decades to grow a potent and capable Australian Defence Force able to project power throughout the Indo-Pacific and contribute to coalition operations globally. We've redoubled and focused our efforts on our alliance relationship primarily with the United States and with our regional partners to support and cooperate with each other in regional force posture and capacity to operate. We need complementary force postures and a sovereign Australian capability bolstered by the presence in the region of allies and partners with credible forces and deterrence capability. But our largest single focus at the moment is on engagement. We are working through an extremely detailed whole-of-government integrated strategy for the region, commencing with our Pacific Step Up, announced by our Prime Minister in November 2018. Our goals are to build regional resilience in the Southwest Pacific through a full spectrum strategy that includes diplomacy, defence cooperation, significant infrastructure development, increased military cooperation and training, and persistent military presence throughout the region. Our goal is to be the partner of choice of our regional neighbours, to be responsive to partner needs, and to help the region be strategically secure, economically stable, and politically sovereign. At the same time, we seek to continue strong engagement and cooperation throughout the Southeast Asia and North Asia region, including with China, using dialogue, diplomacy, cooperation, including military cooperation, to build transparency and understanding. So how do we respond to competition as a middle power in the bottom of the world? We need a clear sense of our national interests, a clear sense of how our national interests align with our allies and partners' interests, and a good understanding of our red lines and how we would seek to respond to those. We need the ability to work independently with allies and partners and to use the full range of statecraft to respond in non-binary ways to competition as it affects Australia. We need a clear public narrative of how this competition is playing out. We need to be extremely clear with the Australian public and in our international engagements of the economic effects, of the impacts of cyber attacks, and so on and so forth. And for defence strategists and military planners, a few questions. Can you deter grey zone competition with conventional military capability? What is a policy framework that balances resilience and deterrence to confront competition and coercion? And what might be a new international understanding of thresholds for open armed conflict and response? So moving forward, we will seek to support international institutions in the rule of law, to continue to use diplomacy, to call out breaches of international norms, to maintain a credible and potent military force, and to show it, to be present, to be active, and to operate in ways that indicate the credible military force. And I think particularly picking up Nancy's force, to start to build new norms of behaviour in the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Admiral Fukuda.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to talk about Japan's deterrence strategy based on new National Defense Program guideline from the perspective of military side. First of all, I would like to outline the recent strategic competition surrounding Japan. It is not too much to say that the Indo-Pacific region is entering a new era of renewed great power competition. China is becoming a major power and has been implementing an ambitious program of military modernization. Its military modernization clearly emboldens China to act more assertively in the region. Liaoning Carrier Strike Group conducted an exercise in the East China Sea and the South China Sea last month. Multiple tests of ASBMs was conducted in the South China Sea in the beginning of this month. In this manner, China seeks to expand its military presence and enhance its operational capabilities in the region. Russia still maintains a considerable scale of military forces in the Far East region. In the vicinity of Japan, the Russian armed force has been increasing its activities. In September last year, Vostok 2018 exercise, which was the largest one in the post-Cold War period, was carried out in the region. In recent years, its activities in the vicinity of Japan, such as strategic patrol by SSBNs and long-range bombers, are specifically increasing. Nuclear-armed North Korea represents a significant threat to the region. North Korea has not modified provocative behavior even after the second US-North Korean summit last February. North Korea launched SLBMs on 4th and 9th of May. In the summit meeting at the DMZ of Panmunjom last month, the two leaders agreed to resume bilateral talks. However, North Korea launched SLBMs on 25th of this month, just 5 days ago, and yesterday. These provocative actions have further raised military tension in the region. Under such strategic competition environment, Japan will make efforts to maintain deterrence through, first, improvement of Japan's own defense architecture. Second, strengthening of Japan-US alliance. And third, multilateral security cooperation. These three pillars will be the core of Japan's deterrence strategy to counter their strategic competitors. Firstly, to deter spurious competitors, we have to improve our own defense architecture. In testing competition environment, it has become vitally important to adapt to warfare that combines capabilities in new domains such as space, cyberspace, and electromagnetic spectrum, and traditional domains. We need to develop our defense capability that can execute cross-domain operation. Secondly, to deter spurious threats in the severe competition, strengthening the Japan-US alliance is vitally essential. It brings stability and prosperity to not only Japan, but also the Indo-Pacific region and the entire world. Japan will further deepen various operational cooperation and political coordination with the US. To enhance the effectiveness of the alliance is a cornerstone of the stable security environment and an effective deterrence for competitors. Thirdly, to deter competitors' threats, multilateral security cooperation is indispensable. Japan will strategically promote multi-layered security cooperation. As part of such efforts, Japan will actively leverage its defense capability to work on defense cooperation and defense exchange programs. Credible deterrence prevents a contingency. It is possible to prevent competition from escalating into a conflict through credible deterrence. In that sense, maintaining the advantage of conventional competition will prevent escalation so that competition strengthens their deterrence strategy. However, the numerical competition of military assets can lead to expansion of the other side. In order to strengthen the deterrence strategy by the competition, it is necessary to properly select the competitive area and maintain the competitive advantage. In other words, the competitive advantage directly affects the credibility of the deterrence strategy. Therefore, we have to develop a defense capability that can execute cross-domain operations, which fuse capabilities in all domains to generate synergy and amplify the overall strength, so that even when inferiority exists in individual domains, such inferiority will be overcome and a credible deterrence will be maintained. We also should strengthen the relationship with our allies and partners to build a favorable security environment and deter strategical competitors. Japan will provide credible deterrence by firmly setting up these three main pillars. Credible deterrence gives the edge on the overall competition and improve the effectiveness of deterrence. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Admiral Fukuda. Lastly, Paul Bernstein.
Thanks, Brad. And thanks to the command for organizing this symposium. I welcome the opportunity to share my thoughts on our topic. These are thoughts that are a work in progress toward developing a framework for understanding the interactions between the big ideas that are driving our defense strategy and aligning them in ways that make sense. I think the National Defense Strategy invites such a line of inquiry. It tells us to compete, deter, and win, a formulation that does not set competition and deterrence against one another, but rather suggests the need to compete more effectively in order to deter more effectively. It's hard to argue with that, but in fact, I think we understand intuitively that when we unpack things, they're more complicated, and we're likely to find and discover potential tensions between competition and deterrence. So to me, it makes sense to study the problem at a more granular level, at the domain level, to see how deterrence and competition play and interact. So I'll talk about three domains: nuclear, cyber, and what I call political warfare. What others may describe or have described as competition below the level of armed conflict or competitive shaping. So just some quick observations on each. On the nuclear issue, 3 points. First, while we've nested our nuclear policy in the strategic competition framework, neither the NDS nor the NPR points us toward aggressive nuclear competition or pursuit of nuclear superiority. The NPR tells us to compete more effectively at the non-strategic level. It directs some new capabilities be developed to narrow a long-standing imbalance in forces, and triad replacement at the strategic level is about sustaining parity in strategic forces. It's not about busting out of it. The second point, while there are some advocates for some types of nuclear overmatch in the belief that we can translate that into meaningful geopolitical advantage, I find it difficult to see the case for actually promoting sharper competition in this area. But even if we wanted to go down that path, we don't seem well postured politically or fiscally to do so. This suggests trying to sustain some type of arms control regime and think about creating some type of competition sanctuary for nuclear forces to help manage risk, and let us focus our energies on other forms of competition that actually may yield more important advantages. That said, and this would be the third point, if the regulatory regime collapses, we're likely to face new competitive pressures and we may find ourselves drawn into some new competitions. These competitive pressures could be driven to a degree by what we do with non-nuclear forces, such as conventional strike or missile defenses, and how other great powers react with their nuclear forces. So the bottom line, I think, in the nuclear arena is that this is one we should want to remain deterrence dominant, but one can see potential developments that create or reinforce competitive pressures that take us down a different path. In the cyber domain, I think competition and deterrence have in fact been set against each other in the policy and academic debate about the utility of deterrence for managing risk and conflict in cyberspace. This debate features on one side those who believe that who believe our experience with nuclear deterrence can be adapted to the cyber problem, and who offer an approach that would be very familiar to anyone who's worked on nuclear deterrence. On the other side are those who see the inherently competitive nature of cyber. Here the catchphrase many of you have heard, persistent engagement, persistent offense. They see this as incompatible with deterrence thinking, with its emphasis on restraint and reasonably well-defined thresholds. So in an environment of constant action and adversaries prepared to take risks, they call for an approach that's based not on the premise of mutual restraint, but on a competitive and offensive mindset that reduces constraints and engages adversaries earlier with the goal of establishing dominance, not so much to change adversary calculations, but to degrade their capabilities. I think we see this debate reflected in our cyber strategy documents. The National Cyber Strategy shows sympathy to both sides of this debate. It adopts the language of persistent engagement, but also prioritizes cost imposition strategies, improving attribution, and establishing a global cyber deterrence initiative. If you look at the DoD cyber strategy, at least the unclassified summary, it's clearly skeptical of the deterrence argument. It talks about persistent cyber campaigns as a key feature of great power competition and the ways in which we will join this competition. It's a very assertive document. It emphasizes offense across the spectrum of conflict. If you compare it to the 2015 cyber strategy, it talks less about mitigating risk, less about controlling escalation. If you look at what our officials are actually saying publicly and what we're actually doing, at least based on open source accounts, I think what we're actually seeing here is an effort to create a de facto synthesis of both these positions. Cyber policy officials are talking not just about degrading adversary capabilities and disrupting operations, they're also talking about deterring adversary behavior by imposing costs and influencing risk calculations. And if you look at the cyber operation we conducted last year to deter Russian interference in the midterm elections, the expressed goal was to generate leverage to change behavior through the fear of costs. And this operation was further characterized as limited in nature because of concerns about Russian retaliation and escalation. So yes, we've gone on the offense. We will be more risk acceptant. But it's just common sense, I think, that in doing so, we'll seek to develop deterrence leverage and weigh the risks of escalation. So to me, this is not the black and white of the academic debate, but it's the gray of the real world, where I think our aspiration for cyber is that it is neither deterrence dominant nor competition dominant, but some kind of hybrid. I think experience will tell us as it accumulates whether and how this works, and a lot will depend on how well we do in learning how to effectively impose costs on those who engage in cyber attacks against us. The last domain is political warfare, where our concern is measures short of conflict that are nonetheless coercive in intent, because they aim to divide, subvert, weaken, co-opt by targeting the legitimacy and effectiveness of our political systems, our social cohesion and solidarity, and our economic sovereignty. These measures are often shrouded in deception and ambiguity. They are what General Gerasimov refers to as a permanently operating front, and they are indeed a form of incremental aggression. But one in which discrete acts by the adversary may not convey much strategic danger, and where it may be difficult to identify clear red lines and credibly threaten cost imposition. So these are among the reasons I'm skeptical that we'll have much success deterring such destabilization campaigns. I think we understand the things that need to be done to counter political warfare. And to me, most of this is best described in the language of competition, resistance, resilience, disruption, denial. It may be possible to deter major operations like efforts to influence national elections, but to me that would be an exception because, and I'm talking mostly about Russia for the moment, because Russia's approach to hostile measures appears to be what we call a so-called soft strategy. It's less defined by specific goals and expectations for the outcomes of specific actions, defined more by a long-term view in which a diffuse set of actions taken today will contribute to favorable strategic outcomes in the future or create opportunities that can be exploited. And I think against this type of approach, it seems to me that deterrence may not be an optimal counter. Russia's not likely to do anything in this sphere that crosses a plausible red line in an attributable way against which a deterrent threat is likely to make sense. And if we and our allies are taking effective steps to counter particular Russian activities, Russia's far more likely to change tactics than to just stop altogether. It's a target-rich environment for them, and they have a pretty diverse toolkit. Okay, so to sum up, I see the nuclear domain as one that we would want to be deterrent dominant, but subject to emerging competitive pressures. Cyber as an aspirational or an emerging deterrence competition hybrid, and political warfare as something that I think is going to be competition dominant. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks to all panelists for excellent, thoughtful, provocative introductory remarks. Let me remind you, if you'd like to join the conversation, the inside back cover of your handbook has the text number to text a question or an email address, or the instruction to simply raise your hand, and I will try and keep an eye out. We have a few minutes for Q&A, and the first goes to Nancy Gallagher about the intentions we attribute to current Russian leadership in contrast to the intentions of the Soviet leadership. Your analysis seemed to attribute similar strategic intentions, and the question here goes to the fact that after Cuba and Berlin crises in the early 1960s, essentially Soviet leadership, Soviet ambitions in Europe became status quo oriented, whereas Mr. Putin has announced himself as the president of new rules or no rules, the deconstruction of the European security order, the generation of disorder around the Russian periphery, and willing to use force to change international borders. So is the historical analogy instructive? Is the historical experience instructive?
I think the historical experience is constructive because the questioner's depiction of the Soviets as changing completely from a revisionist power before the Cuban Missile Crisis and other crises to a purely status quo-oriented power, and their description of Putin today as being purely revisionist with no interest in maintaining the status quo is much too black and white, right? And that's why I'm calling for a more nuanced understanding both of other countries' intentions in the past and of their intentions today. I think Putin has made it clear through a number of actions that he is interested in being in an environment where he's able to achieve his country's security needs through some mix of military capabilities, diplomacy, right? And the great powers working together. But that he sees, in effect, the United States as having been unwilling to consistently abide by the rules of international relations and consequently has taken great liberties himself.
Thank you. Question to Paul Bernstein. Maybe it's to take the level of analysis up one level, and it's a simple question. Is it possible to overcompete? To compete in a manner that generates the intention to harm American and allied interests in a way that didn't previously exist?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's possible to do that. Of course, we're accused of doing that all the time. I mean, this is certainly what the Russians have been saying for a long time, that The U.S. goal is absolute security, that we're developing capability designed to achieve that goal, to sort of unilaterally transcend the bounds of the deterrence relationship that has existed for decades. That's what our missile defense is about. That's what our global strike is about. That's what other kinds of capabilities are about. So, you know, we may debate among ourselves what the limits of competition are, but I think we have to pay attention to how our adversaries pursue this, not necessarily to credit their view, but to be aware that this is how they are interpreting or may interpret the actions that we take. And I think that has to be a factor in how we assess our choices in this sort of balance between deterrence and competition. How might our adversaries perceive this? And, you know, what do we need to do to make our true intent clear? We've pursued various forms of dialogue with Russia and China for many years now. I'm not sure we've made a lot of progress in sort of trying to gain a better mutual understanding of intent. So, yeah, I think it is possible. It's possible to make conscious choices to compete in a very aggressive way. It's also possible to make choices that you believe are not necessarily overly aggressive, but that may be seen otherwise by your adversaries and potentially by some of your allies as well. I hope that helps.
Thank you. A question for Bob Taylor. How does a responsible state attack during competition to win the campaign? What military opportunities do you feel we haven't yet pursued to begin to win the competition?
So attack is a pretty strong word, depending on how you want to define it, and is generally hard to define in the competitive space. I think that's reflective of where we're at in this hybrid gray zone arena. So, you know, what I would say is, you know, responsible activity in this arena is set by international norms to start with. I think you have to start with thinking and having a clear understanding of what you're trying to achieve from a broad, global, U.S. allied set of interests, and where you're willing to take some risks in multi-domain arenas. From a military standpoint specifically, we have gone about this from a U.S. standpoint, from a regional construct, pretty much since Goldwater-Nichols, where the combatant commands at the geographic standpoint have led the effort. Let's face it, particularly with Russia and China, they've got a global contact surface that allows pressure to be applied through multiple different arenas and domains. And what we need to do, I think, is start to break down the authorities and responsibilities associated with these combatant commands to allow the interdependencies and capabilities, particularly in the non-kinetic domains, to be able to apply pressure. Where that crosses a line into attack, those are all political decisions, but I think it's the military's responsibility to have multiple options across that spectrum for senior leaders, whether they be allied or nation-specific, to have choices. I think that we lack some of them choices in this space right now that provide a myriad of escalatory options to regain positions of advantage in this space.
Thank you. A question to our two allies on the panel about where does missile defense fit into this discussion? Where does missile defense fit into our deterrence strategies? How much competition in the missile defense domain is enough? And would you see a meaningful distinction between an answer that focuses on U.S. homeland defense or U.S. and allied regional defenses? Admiral Fukuda, I might start with you, if I may.
Yeah. So as you know, North Korea still continue development of nuclear weapons and still continue ballistic missile launches. So Japan enhanced BMD capabilities further in cooperation with the United States forces in Japan. So we decided to introduce Aegis Ashore to enhance our we call comprehensive air and missile defense capability. So I think it's not enough to defend the around the world, but in the regional perspective, so we just enhance our comprehensive area in the missile capability, including BMD capability, so in cooperation with the U.S. forces.
Thank you. Celia?
Yeah, thank you. I think, look, if we start from the point that credible deterrence has to impose cost, and we understand that particularly in the Indo-Pacific, most of the harder-edged military competition that we see is in substantially expanding missile capabilities in China, in North Korea and so forth, conventional and nuclear, then missile defence has to be part of that balance in the region from the US and with regional partners, because it's obviously a core way to impose cost against that development. Australia is somewhat at a disadvantage in this conversation, but it's part of our future thinking about the nature of an Australian Defence Force that continues to be a credible contributor in the region. But the missile threat in the region is one of the key ways we're going to see the competition grow.
So as former DASD with missile defense in my title, I might add just a thought on this question, which is that from an American perspective, it seems to me there are different contributions to deterrence of missile defense of the American homeland and in the regions. The homeland defense, of course, is not intended to have any deterrence effect vis-a-vis Russia or China. It's intended to negate the coercion threats and the limited attacks that might be conducted by a rogue state, largely for coercive purposes. The threat of North Korea to attack the American homeland is essentially to decouple us, to create too much risk for us to defend our interests and allies in the region. Missile defense is about recoupling. That's why there has been bipartisan consensus on a limited defense for a limited role in our deterrence strategy. The regional missile defense, we have the ambition that it plays an important deterrence role in raising the cost to attack. If an adversary believes it can blackmail us out of a war by sprinkling a few, but sees a significant threshold between few and many, sees too much risk in many, striking with many ballistic missiles, then the role of missile defense in the region is somewhat analogous to the homeland defense role, which is it's a limited role aimed at taking the cheap shots off of the table and driving adversaries to calculate that if they're going to go to war against the United States and its allies, they're going to have to do so with an initial blow which would be very large and thus should be deterrable by other means. Next up, a question back to Paul Bernstein on can you expound on your statement that nuclear deterrence is subject to emerging competitive pressures? Where do you see the potential for failed nuclear deterrence in competition?
I'm not sure I talked about deterrence failing, but I did suggest that if the regulatory regime collapses, and it's something that we can't rule out because it does seem plausible, we are likely to face some new competitive pressures and find ourselves drawn into different kinds of potential competitions. I mean, I think most people in here have thought about this already. In the post-INF world, we may see that as an opportunity to compete more effectively at the conventional level in regions like East Asia. But potentially in Europe, we could face, depending on choices Russia makes, we could face a new nuclear competition in Europe as well. So there are potential trade-offs there. So that's one sort of form of competitive pressure. And I guess a new start, of course, would be the other. We don't know what will happen on New START. Decisions haven't been made yet. If New START expires, though, we can think hypothetically about that. We have to think about the moves each side might make once they're free of those treaty constraints. And I'm not sure I'd predict what the United States or Russia will do in that situation, but we can certainly envision scenarios where, let's say, the Russians move to expand their force in significant ways. And that's something Depending on how far they take that, it might be something we can live with or adjust to, but at a certain point, we may be very concerned about that and find ourselves having to consider countervailing steps. I think missile defense was mentioned here. I mean, one can sort of think about sort of future scenarios for U.S. missile defense, which move in a certain direction that create increasingly acute concerns in Beijing and Moscow and lead to responses with nuclear forces that at a certain point we may need to consider responding to as well. So I think this is all a little bit notional and hypothetical, but as we approach a point, this inflection point in arms control, where we see the possibility of the regime not just eroding but potentially collapsing, I think we can see where some of these nuclear competitive pressures might emerge. Thank you.
So let me ask if any other panelists would like to comment on that subject. The emerging competitive pressures and nuclear deterrence. Okay.
Well, I mean, I suppose that points at me pretty clearly as the representative from USSTRATCOM on this table. So, you know, it seems to me that the emerging competitive pressures associated with nuclear deterrence specifically are less about really the direct relationship that we have or don't have with Russia, you know, the history that we have to include the current New START treaty in effect, and I think what Paul highlighted there is the questionable future of some of those arms control pieces. But from a STRATCOM standpoint, you know, we see that the competitive environment is always about somewhere short of anything associated with nuclear employment, and that's the idea behind this competitive space. So how do you continually send the message with the narrative that says never take that step, that we will hold at risk with unacceptable potential costs with taking those steps? And as was highlighted previously, it's somewhere below that threshold, and as Admiral Cree highlighted in his opening comments, where some of the capability of these, if you want to use Russia for example, is below that strategic threshold, with capabilities that tend to be designed to potentially exploit where we would maybe not respond strategically. So I think that's where, you know, some of the new NPR guidance came from in order to close some of that gap in terms of that competitive space well below what would be strategic nuclear deterrent activities.
Anyone else? No. I think we should, yeah, Nancy?
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm less concerned about a sort of straight up new nuclear arms race emerging than I am about the interactions between nuclear, space, and cyber capabilities in particular. And I think the comment that you made about, well, let's try to just keep the nuclear deterrent relationship as stable and limited as possible while competing in all sorts of other areas. And the United States would very much like to believe that it can do that. I think other countries have said consistently over and over again, you're not going to be able to do that. Right, and you need to think about the interactions of these capabilities, and that's not to say that they're deliberately looking, for example, at space as our Achilles heel, right? I think that again the relationship is much more complex than that, but the more we rely on, the more we try to compete, the more we take risks in other areas and just assume that it's not going to spill over into an inadvertent nuclear war, the more of a chance we are that one of those days the risk is going to go south, right? And that's my big concern, is a war that nobody really wants.
Let me add one further point. Nancy's presentation invites us to think about the lessons of the past. We haven't spoken about the interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s, where presented with the challenge of competition, the United States essentially chose not to compete. And so when we think about a competitive environment today, we tend to think back to the not too distant past of the Cold War competition and our high-level national commitment to compete. One interesting data point from the collapse of the Washington Naval Treaty from the interwar period, Japan withdrew in 1932. When did the United States finally build up to the naval treaty limit that was permitted in the treaty that its treaty partner had abandoned a decade earlier? 11 years. So in some competitive environments, we may choose not to compete, or we may compete in a different way. The questions have proliferated as the time has drawn to a close. We have 5 minutes left, and a number of these questions go to our allies on the panel, so let me summarize these questions as, are we doing enough to align our strategies as nations for deterrence and competition? Well, what are we doing? Are we doing enough? And do you see any outstanding differences in our thinking as so far developed about this new strategic environment? And Celia, if I may start with you this time.
Thank you. When we talk about aligning strategies, I think our mere presence here today is a really important demonstration of how we seek to do that. In the US-Australia Alliance, we work hard through our presence in each other's capitals, in our presence in each other's commands, and in dialogue, formal and informal, to understand and discuss our positions, where we align and where we differ. The culmination